Once there was a man named Daniel who seemed to have everything anyone could wish for. He was wealthy, attractive, and married to Laura, a woman so stunning that many remarked she appeared as though she stepped out of a film. However, lately, Daniel felt unhappy. He harbored a deep, unsettling feeling he couldn't dismiss. One bright afternoon, he sat in his expansive lounge, gazing at a painting on the wall. The artwork depicted a majestic eagle standing proud and tall, but Daniel didn't feel like that eagle. He felt insignificant and doubtful. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Daniel, his father, Mr. Johnson, entered the room. Mr. Johnson was an elderly man with a gentle demeanor, but piercing eyes that seemed to look right through people. He wore a simple white shirt and slightly leaned on his cane. "My son," Mr. Johnson began, settling beside him. "Why do you appear as if you're bearing the weight of the world? Talk to me." Daniel sighed deeply. "Dad, I've been pondering a lot about Laura. I'm not sure if she truly loves me for who I am or just because I'm affluent." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Why do you think that? Has she done something to make you doubt her?" "No, Dad. It's just a feeling. You know how she interacts with the staff. Sometimes she's not harsh when I'm around, but I've overheard her being unkind to the housekeeper a couple of times. It made me wonder if she's only nice to me on the surface." Mr. Johnson leaned back, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "That's a serious concern, my son. But feelings alone aren't enough. You need certainty." Daniel nodded slowly. "Exactly. But how? I can't just ask her if she loves me for me or my money. She'd never admit it, even if it were true." The room fell silent for a moment. Mr. Johnson lightly tapped his cane on the marble floor, a small smile forming on his face. "I have an idea." Daniel looked at him, curious. "What is it, Dad? What if we test her?" Mr. Johnson suggested, leaning forward. "What if I pretend to be your janitor for a while? I'll live here, do the work, and observe how she treats me when she thinks I'm just another employee." Daniel's eyes widened. "Dad, you want to pretend to be a janitor? People might think I've lost my mind letting my own father work as a janitor." Mr. Johnson chuckled. "Don't worry about what others think. This is about uncovering the truth. If Laura is genuinely kind and respectful, she'll treat me well regardless of who I am. But if she's only putting on a facade for you, we'll know." Daniel hesitated. The idea seemed absurd but made sense. "Are you sure about this? It'll be hard work, and what if she discovers the truth? I'll dress the part. No one will recognize me. And as for the work, I'm not afraid. I've been through tougher times than you can imagine." Daniel nodded slowly. "All right, Dad. Let's do it. But we need to plan carefully. If she finds out, it could ruin everything." Mr. Johnson smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, my son. Leave the details to me." The next day, Mr. Johnson began his transformation. He visited a local tailor and ordered simple attire: worn-out trousers, a faded shirt, and an old cap. He also purchased a pair of dusty sandals that looked like they had seen better days. Upon returning home, Daniel couldn't believe his eyes. "Dad, you look completely different. I wouldn't recognize you if I didn't know it was you." Mr. Johnson laughed. "Good. That means Laura won't recognize me either." They reviewed the plan once more. Mr. Johnson would arrive at the estate the following morning, introduced by the house manager as the new janitor. He would live in the small caretaker's cottage at the front of the property, just like any other worker. "Remember," Mr. Johnson said, "you can't treat me like your father while I'm working as the janitor. Act like I'm just another employee." "I understand, Dad, but promise me one thing. If it becomes too much, we'll stop. I don't want you to suffer." Mr. Johnson smiled. "You worry too much, my son. I'll be fine." The next morning, everything went smoothly. The house manager introduced Mr. Johnson to Laura as Mr. Brown, the new janitor. Laura barely glanced at him, nodding curtly before heading to the living room. Mr. Johnson noticed her lack of warmth, but didn't let it affect him. He settled into the small cottage, a humble room with a bed, a chair, and a tiny table. It was a stark contrast to the grand spaces he was accustomed to, but he didn't mind. It was all part of the test. As the day progressed, Mr. Johnson carried out his duties. opening and closing the gate, sweeping the driveway, and monitoring the entrance. Laura passed by a few times, but didn't engage much. Her silence wasn't overtly rude, but it lacked warmth. Later that evening, Daniel checked in with his father in a quiet corner of the estate, away from prying eyes. "How was your first day, Dad?" Daniel asked. Mr. Johnson chuckled softly. "It was interesting. Laura didn't say much to me today, but I can tell she doesn't hold me in high regard. She barely acknowledges me when she walks by." Daniel frowned. "Maybe she's just shy around new people. Let's give it a few days." "Of course," Mr. Johnson replied. "This is just the beginning. We'll see how she behaves over time." Days turned into weeks, and Mr. Johnson adapted to his role, intentionally making minor mistakes to gauge Laura's reactions, like opening the gate too slowly or forgetting to greet her when she arrived. Initially, Laura ignored these blunders, but her patience began to wane. One afternoon, she snapped when he didn't open the gate swiftly enough. "What's wrong with you? Do you think I have all day to sit in this car and wait for you to do your job?" she demanded. "I'm sorry, madam," Mr. Johnson responded humbly, bowing his head. "You should be." Laura rolled her eyes before driving away. Mr. Johnson closed the gate behind her, expecting this reaction but still feeling hurt by her treatment. That evening, he met Daniel again to report what had happened. "She's starting to show her true colors," Mr. Johnson said. "She yelled at me today over something insignificant. I remained calm, but it's clear she doesn't respect me." Daniel's heart sank. "Dad, I don't know what to say. I hoped she would treat you better. But remember, my son, the truth is better than living in doubt. Whatever we discover, you'll know where you stand." Daniel nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. He didn't like hearing this, but was glad his father was helping him uncover the truth. The test continued, with Mr. Johnson maintaining his role and Laura inadvertently revealing more of her true self. What began as a simple plan started to show cracks in a marriage that once seemed flawless. The next morning, Mr. Johnson woke up early as the sun began to rise. The caretaker's cottage was small and simple, but he wasn't there for comfort. He quickly dressed in his worn-out attire, looked at himself in the cracked mirror, and chuckled softly. "Who would believe this is Mr. Johnson?" he whispered before stepping outside. The cool morning air greeted him as he looked around the grand estate, smiling. It was hard to believe he was standing here as a janitor, not as the owner's father. "Let's see how this goes," he muttered. By 7 a.m., Laura was up and bustling around the house, as usual. She wore a bright yellow dress, her makeup impeccable, and her hair neatly tied into a bun. She stepped out of the house, holding her phone in one hand and her car keys in the other. Laura called out as she walked toward the driveway, her voice sharp and loud enough for the staff to hear. "Yes, madam." Mr. Johnson quickly approached the gate, wiping his hands on his trousers as he neared her. "Where were you?" She raised her eyebrows. "I've been standing here for over a minute, and you didn't even notice." "I'm sorry, madam," he said, bowing his head slightly. "I was sweeping the driveway." "Next time, pay attention," she snapped. "You're here to work, not to daydream." "Yes, madam," Mr. Johnson replied calmly. Laura opened the car door and paused, looking back at him to ensure he cleaned the gate. "It looks dusty. I don't want my friends coming here and seeing dirt everywhere." "Yes, madam," he said without another word. Laura got into her car and drove off, the engine's loud sound echoing as she disappeared down the road. Later that day, she returned home earlier than usual with a few shopping bags in hand, looking tired. Mr. Johnson hurried to the gate to open it, but his hand slipped, and the gate didn't move as swiftly as it should. Laura shouted from her car, "What are you doing? Do you think I have all day to sit here?" "I'm sorry, madam," he said, rushing to push the gate open. "Sorry for yourself," she muttered as she drove in roughly. Mr. Johnson stood by the gate, watching her step out of the car. She didn't look at him again as she walked toward the house, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement. He sighed and closed the gate behind her. That evening, Daniel called his father to check on him. They spoke in hushed voices in the caretaker's cottage to avoid being overheard. "How was your day, Dad?" Daniel asked, sitting on the edge of the small bed. "Your wife is something else," Mr. Johnson replied. "She shouted at me twice today over minor things." She doesn't even acknowledge me like a person, just someone here to serve her. Daniel frowned. I was hoping she would treat you better. Maybe she's just stressed. Stressed or not, it doesn't excuse treating people badly. Laura's actions had shown. If she acts this way around someone she considers just a janitor, imagine how she treats others when no one is watching. Daniel leaned back, rubbing his forehead. Dad, I don't know what to do. I love Laura, but this isn't what I expected. Mr. Johnson said gently, we need to keep going, my son. We need to uncover the truth, and we're just getting started. The following days followed a similar pattern. Laura's impatience grew with each passing day as Mr. Johnson continued his subtle tests, making small mistakes to see how she would react. Each time, her response was the same, sharp and unkind. One evening after dinner, a housekeeper approached Laura to inform her that the janitor needed new cleaning supplies. Laura responded irritatedly, demanding that the janitor come and speak to her directly. Later, Laura asked Mr. Johnson to wash her car, pointing out a tiny smudge. After he spent nearly an hour scrubbing it, she found another speck of dirt and berated him for not doing a good job, making him redo the task. That night, Daniel found his father sitting outside the caretaker's cottage, looking troubled. How was today, Dad? Daniel asked. Your wife is not who you think she is, Mr. Johnson replied. Today, she threatened to fire me because I missed a tiny spot near the gate. She treats me as if I'm insignificant. Daniel's face fell. I love Laura, but everything you're telling me makes me question who she really is. Mr. Johnson placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes love blinds us to the truth, my son, but now you see it. What will you do? Daniel sighed deeply. I can't just end my marriage like this, but I also can't ignore what I've seen. We need to continue observing, Mr. Johnson said gently. We'll see what else we uncover, but remember, the truth might not be easy to accept. As the days went on, each one revealed more about Laura's true nature. Mr. Johnson remained patient and determined to help his son see the reality of their situation. Meanwhile, Daniel struggled with conflicting emotions, torn between his love for Laura and the painful truth unfolding before him. One quiet morning, Mr. Johnson sat outside the caretaker's cottage, sipping lukewarm tea. The past few weeks had been challenging, not because of the work, but because of what he had observed. Laura's true nature was becoming clearer each day, and he knew the time to reveal everything was approaching. As he gazed at the grand estate, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. Daniel stepped out, looking sharp in a tailored navy blue suit, though his face showed signs of exhaustion and sleepless nights. He approached his father with a small nod. Good to see you, Dad, Daniel greeted softly. It's good to see you too, my son, Mr. Johnson replied, standing up. How have things been? How is she? Your wife's temper hasn't improved, Mr. Johnson responded seriously. She shouted at me yesterday because the car wasn't polished enough. I've tried to remain patient, but her words are sharp and her respect is non-existent. Daniel rubbed his forehead, pained. I don't understand. She's always kind and cheerful with me. How can she be so different with you? That's the mask she wears, Mr. Johnson said gently. But masks don't last forever. You're seeing her true face now. You asked for the truth, and here it is. Daniel sank onto a nearby bench, his head in his hands. What do I do, Dad? I can't just walk away from her. I love her, but how can I stay with someone who treats people this way? Mr. Johnson sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. You need to decide what kind of life you want, my son. Love is important, but so is respect. Without it, love cannot stand. Daniel looked up, tears welling in his eyes. I love Laura, but everything you're telling me makes me feel like I don't even know her. Mr. Johnson nodded slowly. I understand. Let's see what happens next. That evening, Daniel packed a small bag and informed Laura that he had to leave for another business trip. She didn't question him, merely reminding him to transfer money into her account while he was away. Once Laura was out of sight, Daniel quietly slipped into the caretaker's cottage to observe her behavior without her knowing. The next morning, Laura was in a particularly foul mood, convinced that one of the staff had taken her favorite earrings. She shouted at Mr. Johnson, demanding to know where they were. Daniel watched as her frustration boiled over, realizing just how deeply she harbored anger and disrespect. Later that afternoon, Laura called out to Mr. Johnson, demanding he wash her car, pointing out every tiny imperfection. No matter how diligently he worked, she found faults, making him redo the task repeatedly. Her behavior grew increasingly hostile and unkind, revealing her true colors. One evening, after another harsh confrontation, Daniel met his father in the caretaker's cottage. "You were right, Dad. I've seen it with my own eyes. Laura has no respect for you or anyone else." Mr. Johnson placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes love blinds us to the truth, but now you see it. What will you do?" Daniel admitted, "I can't just end my marriage like this, but I also can't ignore what I've seen." "We need to keep going," Mr. Johnson encouraged. "We need to uncover the truth, and we're just getting started." The following days continued with Laura's impatience and unkindness growing. Mr. Johnson made more deliberate mistakes to test her further, and each time, Laura responded with increasing anger and disrespect. The household staff also began to notice her true nature, feeling demoralized by her treatment. One day, Laura decided to invite friends over for lunch. The house buzzed with activity as the staff prepared for the guests. Mr. Johnson watched quietly from the gate as Laura greeted her friends warmly, a stark contrast to how she treated him and the staff. However, when one guest complimented the flowers, Laura dismissed the gardener's efforts, revealing her lack of appreciation for others' hard work. That night, Daniel found his father sitting outside the caretaker's cottage, looking troubled. "You look troubled," Daniel said softly. Mr. Johnson admitted, "Today, Laura spoke about me as if I were a child who couldn't think for himself. She doesn't respect anyone who isn't on her level." Daniel sighed deeply. "I want to believe she's a good person, but everything you're telling me makes it hard to ignore the truth." Mr. Johnson nodded gently. "But it's better than living a lie." The days continued, each revealing more about Laura's true nature. Mr. Johnson remained patient and determined to see the test through. Daniel struggled with his feelings, torn between love and the painful reality of Laura's behavior. On Daniel's birthday, the house was busy with preparations for the celebration. Laura, dressed in an elegant red gown, moved around barking instructions with her usual sharp tone. Mr. Johnson observed from afar, knowing that today would change everything. As the guests began to arrive, Laura greeted them warmly, her cheerful demeanor masking her true nature. However, when one guest complimented the flowers, Laura belittled the gardener's efforts, revealing her lack of appreciation and respect. Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped out of the caretaker's cottage, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He walked into the house quietly, unnoticed by the guests. Laura was busy entertaining her friends when Daniel interrupted the celebration. "Excuse me, everyone," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Laura's smile froze in surprise. "Daniel, I thought you were out of town." He responded evenly. "I was, but I decided to come back early. Today is a special day." Her smile returned but looked forced. "Yes, of course. Happy birthday, my love. We've been waiting for you." Daniel nodded and turned to the guests. "Thank you all for coming. Before we continue, there's something important I need to share." The guests exchanged curious glances as Laura's smile faltered slightly. "What's going on, Daniel?" she asked, her voice uneasy. Daniel gestured toward the door. "Papa, please come in." All heads turned as Mr. Johnson stepped into the room, still dressed as the janitor. The room erupted in stunned silence as Laura's face turned pale. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Laura, meet Mr. Johnson, the man you've been shouting at and disrespecting for weeks. He's not just a janitor. He's my father," Daniel announced firmly. Laura looked from Daniel to Mr. Johnson, her face a mix of shock and fear. "Your father?" "Yes, my father," Daniel confirmed. "I asked him to pretend to be a janitor to see how you would treat someone you thought was beneath you. Now I know the truth." Laura's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know," Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt my father, and you hurt everyone who works here." You showed no mercy to those you thought were beneath you. Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his expression calm but his eyes filled with disappointment. Respect is something you give to everyone, regardless of their position in life. You've shown me who you truly are, and it breaks my heart. Laura fell to her knees, sobbing. Please, Daniel. I'm sorry. I didn't mean any of it. I'll change. I promise. Daniel looked at her, his heart torn. He had loved her deeply, but the woman kneeling before him was not the woman he thought he had married. The room remained silent as the guests watched the scene unfold in disbelief. Taking a deep breath, Daniel spoke firmly. I need time to think about everything. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know that respect and kindness are non-negotiable. You've hurt me deeply, and it will take time to heal. Laura nodded, her sobs quieting. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, she whispered. Mr. Johnson placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Take your time, Daniel. It won't be easy, but you must follow your heart. As Daniel helped Laura to her feet, the room remained silent, the air heavy with tension. The guests, who had come for a celebration, now found themselves witnessing the unraveling of a marriage that once seemed perfect. After most of the guests had left, only a few remained, whispering among themselves, unsure of what to do next. Laura stood in the middle of the living room, her cheeks wet with tears, looking exhausted from crying and begging for forgiveness. Daniel stood a few steps away, his hands hanging at his sides, looking at Laura with sad eyes as if seeing her for the first time. He didn't know what to say or how to feel. Everything he had learned in the past weeks swirled inside his mind like a storm. He felt hurt, angry, and lost. He had loved this woman with all his heart, but now he wasn't sure who she really was. Nearby, Mr. Johnson stood calm and firm, leaning on his cane. He had seen many things in life, but this situation hurt him deeply because it involved his only son. He had hoped Laura would pass the test, show kindness, and prove that wealth had not blinded her heart. But she had failed, and now they were all picking up the pieces. Laura took a shaky step toward Daniel, her voice a whisper. Please, she said, her eyes wide and full of tears. I know I messed up. I know I was wrong. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Daniel didn't move. He just listened, his heart heavy. He wanted to believe her, to trust her words, but he also remembered how she had treated his father, a good man who had done nothing wrong. He remembered the shouts, the insults, the threats. How could she do that and then say she was sorry? Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice hoarse. You didn't just hurt me. You hurt my father, and you hurt the people who work here. You showed no mercy to those you thought were beneath you. Laura's tears fell faster. I know. I'm sorry. I was cruel. I don't know what came over me. I was so caught up in my own world. I forgot how to be kind, how to treat people like human beings. Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his voice steady but sad. Kindness isn't something you remember only when you're in trouble. It's something that should live in your heart every day. You don't need to know someone's title or position to show respect. We are all human and deserve to be treated with care. Laura nodded, looking down at the floor. You're right. I failed. I didn't treat you with respect, and I didn't treat others with respect either. Please, Mr. Johnson, please forgive me. Mr. Johnson looked at her for a long moment, then closed his eyes and sighed. Forgiveness isn't just a word, Laura. It's something you earn by changing your ways. Words alone mean little if your heart doesn't change. Laura sank to her knees again, pressing her hands together as if in prayer. I will change. I promise I will show kindness. I will show respect. I will do whatever it takes to make it right. Just don't leave me like this. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to comfort her, but he also felt wary. Could he trust her words? Would she revert to her old ways when no one was watching? His mind drifted back to the staff, the housekeeper, the cook, the driver. People who had done their jobs quietly and faithfully, only to be shouted at and looked down upon. They deserved better. He turned his head slightly and saw the housekeeper standing in the corner, tears in her own eyes. She had been yelled at so many times, and the cook stood behind her, nervously rubbing his hands. The driver stood near the door, unsure if he should stay. They were all watching, waiting to see if this was real or just another act. Daniel took a step toward them, and Laura followed his gaze. Her eyes widened, and fresh shame washed over her face. She realized that she had not only hurt Daniel and Mr. Johnson, but also everyone who worked in the house. She had made their lives difficult for no reason. "Please," she said, turning to them, her voice shaking. "I know I don't deserve it, but please forgive me. I treated you badly, and I'm sorry. I will try to earn your trust again. I will show you that I can be better. I will respect you. I promise." The staff looked at each other, unsure of what to say. The housekeeper sniffed, wiping her tears. She had served in different homes, and new people like Laura came and went, but this one had shown a tiny spark of regret. Could that spark grow? The cook cleared his throat softly. "Madam," he said, "if you truly want to change, we will see it in your actions. Words are easy, but show us with time that you mean what you say. Maybe then we can trust you again." Laura nodded quickly. "I will. I will do anything. I know you don't believe me now, but I will show you. I will work hard to earn back your trust." Mr. Johnson watched the exchange quietly. He turned to Daniel and placed a hand on his shoulder. "My son, the decision is yours. I can't tell you what to do. This is your marriage, your life. But remember, respect must be the foundation of love. Without it, love is weak and can break easily." Daniel felt tears form in his own eyes. He looked at Laura, the woman he had once idolized, seeing her flaws and the fear and sorrow in her eyes. Could people change? Could she truly learn to be kind? Did he have it in him to give her another chance? "I won't lie to you," Daniel said quietly. "I'm hurt and disappointed. I don't know if I can trust you again, but I will give you a chance to prove yourself, not with words but with actions." Laura's face lit up with hope. She reached out, but Daniel took a small step back, lifting his hand to stop her. "No, don't celebrate yet," he warned. "This won't be easy. We will need help. We need to see a counselor, someone who can guide us. We have many things to fix." "I understand," she said quickly, apologizing and showing more care to everyone present. "I will do anything. I will see a counselor and give more care to everyone here. I will do it." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly, then looked at Daniel. "My son, I will leave you both to work this out, but know this, I will be watching from afar. Not to catch you in a mistake, but to see if your words turn into truth." Laura bowed her head. "Yes, Dad. I will earn your trust." Mr. Johnson turned to leave, and the guests who remained cleared a path for him. His back was straight, and his head held high, reminding everyone that he was not just a janitor but a man who valued honor above all else. Before reaching the door, Mr. Johnson stopped and turned back to Daniel. "My journey here is done for now. I will come back when the time is right. Until then, be strong and stay true to yourself." Daniel nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "Thank you, Dad," he said softly. "Thank you for showing me the truth." Mr. Johnson stepped outside, disappearing into the night like a quiet shadow. The house felt different now, emptier, quieter, yet filled with the promise of something new. Laura stood still, unsure if she should run after Mr. Johnson or hold her husband's hand. The staff watched her, waiting to see what she would do next. Would she return to her old ways now that the storm had passed, or would she keep her promise? Daniel studied her face, seeing the fear and sorrow there. He took a deep breath and spoke gently. "Come with me, Laura. We need to talk." She followed him into a small sitting room away from the remaining guests. He closed the door, and they stood facing each other. "I will give you a chance," Daniel said softly, "but I need to see real change. We will get help, talk to someone who can guide us. You will treat our staff with kindness and respect. You will remember that we are all equal and that money does not make you better than anyone else." Laura nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "I understand," she said. "I promise to try every day to be better. If I fail, I will get back up and try again." Daniel nodded. "We can start fresh, but I won't forget what happened. We must build trust again. It will take time." She squeezed his hand gently, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I know," she said. "I will wait as long as it takes. I'm sorry, Daniel. I truly am." He looked into her eyes, trying to see if her heart was sincere. For now, he would believe her words, but time would tell if she meant what she said. Outside, the night sky stretched wide, a million stars watching from afar. Somewhere out there, Mr. Johnson was on his way home, his mind filled with thoughts of what he had seen. He had revealed his true identity, tested his daughter-in-law, and found her wanting. But he had also given her a chance to change, and sometimes that chance was the greatest gift of all. The staff slowly returned to their work, cleaning up after the party that had turned into a moment of truth. They whispered among themselves, wondering if Laura would keep her word. The guests who remained finally said their goodbyes and left, uneasy but curious about what would happen next. In the small sitting room, Laura and Daniel stood side by side, holding hands. They had a long road ahead of them, filled with challenges, doubts, and hard work, but it might also lead to understanding, forgiveness, and a love built on respect. As the night deepened, a calm hush fell over the estate. Laura knew she had narrowly avoided losing everything and now had to prove her worth, not just to Daniel and Mr. Johnson, but to herself. Could she really change? Could she become the kind of person she should have been all along? No one knew the answer yet. All they had were hopes, promises, and the flicker of light in Laura's eyes that might glow brighter if she truly tried to be better. The story did not end here. It hovered like a question mark in the night, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. Would Laura earn their trust again? Would Mr. Johnson return one day to find her changed? Would Daniel's broken heart mend? And would their love grow stronger than before? Only time would tell. As the lights in the estate slowly dimmed, the stage was set for a new beginning. The world outside waited, silent and patient, as this family found its path toward healing. They stood at the edge of a story that had not yet been fully written, leaving everyone who had witnessed it wanting more. Thanks for watching. Here is another interesting story to watch. Click to watch now.